In the last video, we saw how to export our table of transactions to CSV and other formats. What we're going to do in this video is extend that example, and we're going to allow users to actually import data from a CSV file into the application. Now you can see on the application we added this icon for exporting the transactions, and we're doing this using the Django import-export package. This is a Django application for importing and exporting data with admin integration as well that we've not shown in the previous video. What we're going to do in this video is show how to actually import data, and we're going to use this resource class, the transaction resource that we set up in the previous video, in order to do that. So the benefit of importing data directly from a file into the application is that you can take predefined data and you can bulk load it into the database, and that avoids you having to add transactions one at a time using the form that we set up earlier on. So what we're going to do to get started here is we're going to add another icon at the top right here. So as well as the download or export icon, we're going to go to hero icons and we're going to get an import icon as well. So I'm on the Hero Icons site just now, and we've got a link to that in the description. I'm going to search for an upload icon, and what we're going to do is we're going to use this icon here. It's the arrow up tray. I think that's the best one to use, and we're going to add that to the transaction container. So let's go back to VS Code, and I'm going to load up that Django template transactions container, and we're going to scroll down to where the SVG elements are defined. So I'm going to minimize the sidebar at the moment. What we have is a div with the class of flex. And within that div, we currently have two anchor tags that each have a nested SVG element for the icon for that particular link. And this anchor tag here is one that uses HTMX to send a request to an export URL, and that has the SVG that you see on the page. So if we go back to the application now, this one here is what you're seeing from this SVG. So what we want to do is actually copy this anchor tag, and I'm going to copy that down just below the existing one, and we're going to change the URL here to a new URL that we're going to define soon called import. And we can remove the hx include reference here, so we're going to get rid of that. And within the anchor tag, we're going to go back to hero icons and we're going to copy this SVG element here. Once we've copied that, we can go back to VS Code and replace this existing SVG element. And if we go to the right hand side, I'm going to change the classes here to match what is on the other icon. So let's add these here, and we can then save the file. Now we don't have an import URL in the application at the moment, so we're going to add that in a second. Now let's just have a look at this without the hx get request just to make sure that everything is okay. So I'm going to comment this out, and let's add an empty anchor tag for now. And we can go back to our application. When we refresh this page, we now see we have the other icon for uploading or importing data from a file into the application. So that's what we're going to work with. When the user clicks this, we want to import a file. Now note that we could improve this UI, of course. For example, we might want to add tooltips to these icons. We might want to change the styling, the sizes, the colors, and so on. We're going for a kind of basic UI here. Nothing too complicated, so we're going to stick to that for now. Now I'm going to add those HTMX attributes here to the anchor tag. So let's uncomment this, and we have an hx get request to an import URL. I'm going to add a couple of extra attributes here. So hx push URL. So what that's going to do is basically push a particular URL to the browser's history. I'm going to set that to true, and that's going to push the import into the URL. And we also want to set a target, so when we get back a response from Django, we want that HTML response to be swapped in at this target element. And what we're going to do is we're going to target the transaction block. So it's the same as the anchor tag above here for creating a transaction. So let's paste that in here, and we'll explain what this is later on when we actually wire up all of the functionality. So before we go on, we need to create the import URL. So what I'm going to do is go to urls.py within the tracker application. At the bottom, we have our export URL. I'm going to add another URL here called import, and that's going to call a view called import transactions. And that's got the same name as we specified in the template, and that's very important. So now we can go to views.py, and I'm going to go right down to the bottom of this file here. So we defined our view for exporting the different database transactions to a file. What we're going to do now is define our import transactions view. That's going to take the request as a parameter, and I want to decorate this with the login required decorator. So this is only available to authenticated users. Now for now, I just want this view here to return a template partial that we're going to create, and that's going to be import transaction.html. So let's create that now. I'm going to go to the sidebar here, and let's go into the partials directory that we have, and we're going to create one more of these now. So import transaction.html. And what I want to do is actually take the create transaction template here. I'm going to copy that and we're going to paste it into this template because it's going to be a very similar structure, I think. I'm going to change the header tag here to say import transactions because that's what we're going to do. And I'm going to remove this HTMX attribute from the form class. And I'm also going to remove this include statement. We don't need that at the moment. And finally, we have a button here that says add. Instead of add, I'm going to change the text within that to upload. And what we're going to do basically in this page is we're going to add an input of type file to the form. And that's going to allow the user to upload a file from the file system into the application. And if you're not familiar with previous videos, these are using utility or component classes from 𝗬𝗬𝗡 UI in order to style the buttons. So I'm going to save this and let's summarize what's going on here. We've added a new anchor tag that's going to send a GET request to the import URL. That URL pattern is then going to call the import transactions view, and that view function is going to return this partial called import-transaction.html. So we expect to see this page here when we click our new icon. Let's test that out. We're going to go back to the page, refresh the page here, and when we click this button here, we're taken to this page. Currently we have an empty form at the moment with 2 buttons below. We're going to change that up now. But in order to do that, I want to look at a page in the HTMX documentation for uploading a file. So when you upload a file here, you need to specify an encoding type using the hx encoding attribute, and we set that to multi-part form data. And we also have an hx post attribute to tell HTMX that we're sending a post request here. And you can see within the form that we have an input of type file. Now what I want to do here is I actually want to copy the form element that we have here. And we're going to go back to the template and I'm going to replace this form, and we can remove the ID here. We don't need that. We do need the encoding of multi-part form data, and we're going to send a post request, but we're going to replace this with a URL template tag in Django. And the URL we want to send the post request to is the import URL. Now that's the new one that we just defined there, so that currently takes a GET request and returns this page that we see here. But when we actually submit the form by clicking this upload button, we want to send a post request to the same view function. So that's going to need to handle that post request. Now let's go back to VS Code and we're going to add an input field of type file. And I'm going to do this in a div with a class of margin bottom 4 from Tailwind, and that's going to give some margin between this input that we're going to add and the buttons below. So then we define an input, and I'm going to give it a type of file, of course. And as well as that, let's give it a name of file as well. And we're going to give it some classes from 𝗬𝗬UI's file component. So I'm going to go to the 𝗬𝗬UI documentation, and I've left a link to this in the description as well. So 𝗬𝗬UI has some classes for file input fields. For example, we have this class here for the input element, and that's a 𝗬𝗬UI component class. So let's add that just now. And I'm also going to add a max width of extra small here for this input field, and we can close off the input tag. So let's now show this. We're going to go back to the browser and click this button, and you can see this file component that we have on the page now. I think we should maybe change the color here. So let's go back to what we have here, and you can change the color with this modifier, file input primary. Let's try that one out. If we go back to the class here and paste that in, let's go back to our page, and we're going to go back through the transaction list page. When we click that, this time we're getting a purple color. It's not the best. So we're going to match it up to the button below. Let's go back again one more time. So it's button success. We can change this to file input success. And again, we're going to go back to this and see how that looks. Maybe that's a little better. Not the best styling here, but we're not going to do any more of that. If you want to style this up any better, we have a Git repository. So feel free to open up any pull requests. But it's not too important, to be honest. As long as we can actually upload a file and then import those transactions into the database, then that's all we're really looking to achieve in this video. So now let's go back to VS Code and go to the view function here for importing transactions. We need to actually handle when we send that post request. So we can do that in Django by checking the method property on the request object. So we're going to check if that's equal to post, and then we can get the file from the request. So it's going to be the request.files property. And that returns a query dictionary object in Django, and we can extract particular values using the .get function. And we're looking for the name file here within that. And the reason for that, if we go back to import transaction, that's the name that we gave to the input element. So when we submit the form for this particular field, that's what we're looking to extract. We can do it with this line of code here in the Django view function. So for now, I just want to print this file to the terminal and just see what we get back here. And what I'm going to do is try and actually upload a file now. So the file I've got prepared is this one here. It's very simple. We have two transactions in this CSV file, and you can see the columns at the top here from amount to category. So what we're going to do is upload this file, and we're going to see what happens when we do that. So let's go back to the browser now and go back to our import page. I'm going to choose that file now. So I'm going to click the component here, and that loads up this browser. And it's transactions 4 that we're going to select here. Now notice that when we select that, we don't actually see anything here, and that's because the text that appears in the input element for this file has the color white, so we need to change that. So I'm going to go back to VS Code, and let's move the classes for the input to a new line. And we're going to give it the text white class as well. And I'm actually going to add one more property, and that's the accept property here. We want this input to only accept files that have an extension of .csv. Now, if you want to see more about how to limit the file types that can be uploaded into a Django application, check out the previous video we did on the topic that's appearing on the screen now. This is a very basic way of trying to limit that, but there are more advanced techniques and more robust techniques that you can use in a Django project. So we've added that now, and importantly, text white has been added here. So we should now see the actual text appearing here when we go back to this page. So let's go back, and we're going to choose that transactions 4 file. And it's not appearing, and that's my mistake. This should be another color, should be text black or any other color that's not white. Let's try it one more time and go back to the page. When we come back here, we can actually see text now within the file component. We're going to select transactions 4 and click upload, and you can see we're getting back a weird response. We're going to fix that very soon. And if we go back to VS Code and look at the terminal here, you can see we have something being printed out for the file here, and that's coming from the view function. And if we go back to views.py, what we're doing is getting that file out of the request and printing it to the terminal. So what we need to do now is take the file that we have in the Django view and use Django-import-export to handle importing a CSV of transactions. So in order to determine what happens during an import, we can go back to the resources.py file with the Django-import-export model resource class. And I'm going to go down to the meta class where we defined these fields. And we can define another field here, and that's going to be import ID fields, and that again is going to be a tuple. And we can copy the values that we have above down into this field. And this field here, it means that if a row has the exact same values for all of these fields, it is not going to be added to the database. So when we import a file here, if we have values for these that match something that's already in the database, then we're not going to get that added to the database. So basically it functions a bit like a unique constraint as far as I'm aware. So we're adding these import ID fields. And the reason for this is that we can't use the ID because if we look at the data that we're going to upload, well, the user doesn't control the ID. These are transactions that we want to import into the database, and the database is going to auto-generate the primary key, but we can't upload a file that already contains that primary key. So this is what we're going to use to basically uniquely identify a transaction. You can do that in Django import-export with this property of the meta class. Now, one thing I want to do is mark these dates in the future. So I'm going to change 2024 to 2025 here, and the same for this one at the bottom. So these are going to be the most recent transactions in the database. And the reason for that is just so that we can see them more easily when we go to the list page. So let's go back to views.py now that we have this, and we're going to change this logic here to actually handle the upload using that resource class. Now before we do that, we're going to go to the top, and from the tablib package I want to import the dataset object. And remember from the previous video, the Django import-export package, it relies on functionality provided by this lower level tablib package under the hood. And the core object at the heart of tablib, as it says here, is this dataset object. Now let's go back down and we're going to see how to use that dataset object. I'm going to remove the print statement, and we're going to instantiate a resource object, and that's going to be that transaction resource class from Django import-export. And then we're going to create a dataset object as well by instantiating the tablib dataset. Now what we do with the dataset is we call a function called load, and that takes an input stream where basically the source data is coming from, as well as a format which can be something like CSV. That's what we're going to use in this video. The dataset.load function, we're going to pass the file.read function into that. So we're going to read that file and we're going to decode it, so converting the bytes to a string. So that's going to be the first parameter for the input stream to the dataset. And the second one is the format, and that's going to be set to CSV in this case. If you're reading from a different file source, for example, JSON file or a YAML file, you can specify that here, and that should also work with Excel files. Now once we have a data set, what we're going to do is get a result object by calling the resource.importData function. And what we're going to pass to that is the data set. And let's pass a parameter called dry run equals true for now. And when you set dry run to true, the transaction that would add the data from that data set to the database using this resource is going to be rolled back. So it's not actually going to change the underlying database. So we're going to do a dry run just to have a look at things before we actually try this out for real. Once we have a result, we can then check if the result has errors. So what I'm going to do is add this statement here. If not result.has errors. So the result might have errors, but if it doesn't have errors, we want to execute the code in this if statement. And then what we can do here is we can call the resource.import-data function. And instead of dry run being set to true, we can set that to false. So basically, if there are no errors during the dry run, we can then actually run the import for real. So I hope that makes sense. We are going to go over this after we've added a couple of extra things. This is not going to work at the moment, so let's go and demonstrate what's going on. If we go back to our application here and refresh the page, and then go back to this import page, we're going to select that same transactions4 file that we have on our file system, and we're going to click upload, and we get that same response back. If we go back to VS Code and we look at the terminal, we're not really seeing anything going on, and I think that's because we do have errors. As I said, this is not going to work. So what I'm going to do here, just above this function here, is we're going to iterate over each row in the result. We can do that with a for loop, so it's going to be for row in result, and then we can take each row and iterate over the errors in the row. So for error in row.errors, what we can do is we can print out the error. Now, if there are any errors, that's going to print them to the terminal. So let's try this again, and we're going to see if we have any problems. So we're going to choose that same file and upload that to the file system. And if we go back here, let's have a look at the terminal to see what's going on. So we have an integrity error. A not null constraint has failed, and that's the user ID. So that makes sense. If we go back to models.py here, if we scroll down to the transaction model that we're trying to import, that needs a user. There's a foreign key on that, and it's not a nullable field. So we need to attach the user to these transactions. But if we go back to the CSV file, you can see that we don't actually have a user here. We have all of the other columns, but the user should be derived automatically when the file is uploaded by whoever is authenticating and actually uploading that file. So how do we do that with the Django import-export resource? What we can do is go back to views.py, and when we call the import data function here, we can actually pass a user as a keyword argument and set that to request.user. And I'm also going to do that below within this if statement. So if everything is fine, we can also add the user to this. Once we've added those, I'm going to go to the documentation for Django import-export. So on the resource API, obviously we have this resource class, and it has numerous functions that we can use to hook into different parts of the import and export process. So one I want to look at now is this one called after init instance. So we can override this function, or this method, sorry, on the resource to add additional logic during the import. So let's go back to VS Code and go back to our resources.py file. And just above the meta class, I'm going to add this function called after init instance. And that's going to take self, obviously, as it's a method on the class, as well as the instance as a parameter. And it also takes a couple of extra parameters. We can look at the documentation here. New is a Boolean flag that indicates whether the instance is new or it already exists in the database. And we can skip the row, and we're just going to pass the keyword arguments in here. And what we can do with that, if we go back to VS Code, is we can define the method here, and we can set the user on the instance. So instance.user is going to be equal to quargs.getUser. And the reason we have a user in the keyword arguments being passed to this method is because if we go back to views.py, we added that explicitly here. So we're passing user into the keyword arguments of import data, and that's going to pass that through to the after init instance method and then attach the user to the instance. So will this work now? Let's save that and go back to our application and go back to the list page. When we click this button, we're going to choose the same file as before and click upload. And this time, if we go back to VS Code, let's go down to the very bottom here and see if we have any issues. And we are actually getting an issue. After init instance, it takes 3 positional arguments, but 4 were given. So I'm going to go back to the resource and let me try adding the row to that as it was in the documentation. So let's add that, and we're going to try this again. Hopefully it's going to work. If we click this button and we add our transactions file and click upload, let's go back to VS Code again. And this time we don't seem to be seeing any errors. So I think fixing the signature of this function to also have the row keyword argument was important here. And then we associate the user with the instance that's being uploaded. Let's go back to the list page and see if those have actually been added. At the top here, we have a couple from 2025. So these are both expenses for food and bills with the values 444 and 333. Let's go back to the CSV file, and these match what we had in this file. So that import of the data from this file has been successful. We now have these objects appearing in the database and appearing on our user interface when the user navigates to the transactions page. And it's pretty simple to actually do this. We just click this button here, upload a file, and then they are going to get added to the database if everything is okay. Now let's walk through this process of how this is actually working, because I think it's important to go over this. So we have our resource from Django-import-export. And we have a template called import-transaction.html, and that contains a form that has a file input here that accepts CSV files that we want to upload and then import the data from those CSV files into the database. And this uses HTMX to send a post request with multi-part form data as the encoding when this form is submitted. Now when the form's submitted, we go to views.py here, and it's this import transactions view that's called. And when we have a post request, what we're doing is we're extracting the uploaded file, and then we create a resource object for that transaction resource, as well as a tablib dataset. And the dataset, we can use the load method on that to read in the file from an input stream here. So we call file.read.decode. That's going to take the data that was uploaded in that file and load it essentially into the dataset object. And we specify also the format here, and that was CSV, but of course you can change that to whatever you want as long as it's supported by the dataset object. So that loads the data from the file into this dataset object, and then we can use Django import-export. We can use the resource class, which has a method called import data. And all we need to pass into import data is the tablib dataset with the loaded data that we did on the line above. And also we can pass keyword arguments if we need to, for example, to associate the user with the uploaded transactions. And we also pass dry run equals true, and then we can iterate over any potential errors that we have when we perform that import. If we don't have any errors though, what we're going to do is we're going to call import data. Again, we're passing the tablib dataset and the user, and this time it's not going to be a dry run. And what that's going to do is it's going to use the resource from Django import-export, and that's going to import the data from the file, from the tablib dataset, into the database. And the reason for that, if we go back to resources.py, this is a model resource. So when we call import data, it's going to try and create these model instances in the database. So this resource is tied to the transaction model. So for each row in the uploaded file, it's going to try and create a transaction in the database for that row. And this method here is just a hook that we can hook into during the import process. And that's going to set the user on the instance to the user that's passed in the keyword arguments. So that's the whole flow here. I hope that makes sense. If you want any more content around this package, let me know in the comments. But I want to do a couple of final things in this video. So let's go back to views.py, and we're going to do this pretty quickly. What I'm going to do here, if the result has no errors, we're going to add a context here. And if the result does have errors, we're going to add another context, and each of these contains a message. So if we have no errors, we're going to say that the length of the dataset, that number of transactions were uploaded successfully. Otherwise, if we have an error, what we're going to do is we're going to return a message that says, sorry, an error occurred. Once we've added those two context dictionaries, what we're going to do is return a render statement for the post request. So I'm going to copy this, and we're going to place that here. And we're going to change what's returned here. So instead of import transaction, it's going to be transactions-success. So that's a partial that exists to indicate a message to a user. So that's going to take whatever message was added in this if-else block, and it's going to display that on the page. So let's now test this out. If we go back to the browser, I'm going to refresh the page here, and we're going to go to the upload page and select that same file. If we click upload, nothing is happening. Let's go back to VS Code here and expand the terminal. So we're getting a problem. The template does not exist. That's my mistake. This is called transaction-success.html. Let's try this one more time and go back to the page. So when we click upload after we select a file here, we're going to be taken to this success page. Now we should be seeing a message here, but currently we don't actually see anything. Let me inspect this to see if there is any text in this alert. It looks like we have an empty span here, and I don't think I've got any text. So there's been a problem here clearly. And I think the problem is I didn't add the context to this render statement as a third parameter. Sorry about that. Let's try this one more time. We're going to go back to my transactions and go back to this page. Let's select our file and click upload. And this time you can see we get back a message, 2 transactions were uploaded successfully. So we got back the number 2 here in the context by taking the length of the tablib dataset object. And then we added that message and rendered that partial here that can actually take the message and display it to the page. So that's all for this video. If you've enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up on YouTube. We've covered how to take Django import-export, and we've created a resource class in the previous video and extended that in this video that allows us to upload transactions from a CSV file into the database, and it also allows us to export our transactions to a file based on this page here. And that all works seamlessly with HTMX and the form that you see in the right hand side. So as one example in your application, you could take the transactions between 2 dates and you could export them to a file and then share them with, for example, a data analysis team or a marketing team. And that's very useful in your organization. It allows your users to get the data they need out of the database and into a format that they can then use for analysis and other purposes. And the ability to import data like this from a file is very useful. It prevents you having to add things one at a time, and it allows you to bulk upload something that can be extremely useful in your applications. So Django import-export is a very useful package for working with data and importing and exporting data to and from files. This works really well with the Django admin as well. If you want to check out a previous video we done on that, it should be appearing on the screen now. That was a video on the Django Unfold admin theme. But otherwise, that's all for this video. If you want to support the channel, check out the Ko-fi page that we have in the description, and that'll help us keep this content on YouTube for free. And subscribe to the channel if you've not already done so, that would really help. And thank you again for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.